At the
The
beginning of
Patna
the
Opium,
19th
as
century,
agreed.
the
And the
Qing
silver
Empire
for the
perceived
silk.
itself as
Our
the center of
partnership,
the
the
universe.
Patna Opium, as
Emperors of the
agreed.
Manchu
And the
dynasty
silver
ruled
for the
over a
silk.
vast country with a
Our partner-
population of about 300 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. Beijing viewed overseas traders as barbarians who brought tribute and begged for the right to conduct trade. Europeans arrived seeking silk, porcelain, and tea, but the Chinese saw no reason to purchase anything from them in return. Silver flowed into the Middle Kingdom in a continuous stream, settling in imperial treasuries and the pockets of wealthy merchants. The British East India Company lost millions of pounds sterling annually, paying with silver for the Chinese goods that were so beloved in London and across Europe. Tea had become the national beverage of the British. Every morning, millions of Britons began their day with a cup of hot tea imported from the Fujian and Zhejiang provinces. Aristocrats drank it from fine porcelain in their drawing rooms, while workers consumed it from crude clay mugs in factories. Demand grew every year, but the Chinese sold tea only for silver. They refused British woolen fabrics and had no interest in industrial goods. Trade was conducted under strict rules through a single port, Guangzhou, which Europeans called Canton. There, foreigners were permitted to live only in a special quarter on the banks of the Pearl River, in cramped factories surrounded by walls. Chinese officials controlled every move and every transaction. Foreigners were forbidden from traveling deep into the country, learning the Chinese language, or interacting with local women. They lived in isolation, as if in a gilded cage, from which they saw only the embankment and the murky waters of the river. British merchants were furious at such treatment. They were accustomed to dictating terms in India, where the East India Company effectively ruled vast territories. They considered themselves representatives of a great empire upon which the sun never set, yet here they were forced to bow before Chinese officials, labeled as barbarians, and restricted in their rights. The company's trade agents searched for a way to turn the tide and find a commodity that the Chinese would want to purchase. Opium had already been a feature of trade between India and China long before the British realized its potential. Portuguese and Dutch merchants had brought small shipments of opium from their colonies as early as the 15th century. British traders had also sent opium to China since the beginning of the 15th century, but volumes remained modest. Opium was perceived as one of many goods, no more important than pepper or sandalwood. However, by the end of the 16th century, the situation began to change. The demand for opium in China gradually grew, and British merchants noticed this trend. They realized that a possibility existed to solve their trade problem, to turn the unprofitable trade with China into a lucrative one. Poppies had been grown in India for centuries. Farmers in Bengal and Bihar collected milky sap from incisions in poppy pods, dried it in the sun, and formed dark, sticky balls. Opium was used as a medicine for pain, diarrhea, and coughs. Doctors prescribed it for a variety of ailments, but opium caused addiction. People who began to smoke or eat opium regularly quickly became dependent. They could not stop. The body demanded a new dose, and without it, terrible torments would begin. Bone aches, convulsions, insomnia, and cold sweats. Opium had also long been known in China, introduced by Arab merchants in the Middle Ages. Wealthy Chinese occasionally smoked opium for pleasure, mixing it with tobacco. But the scale of consumption remained small. The imperial court issued its first decree against opium in 1729, banning its sale and smoking. However, the British saw in opium the chance to solve their trade problem. The East India Company took control of opium production in India, turning it into a state monopoly. Farmers were required to sell all their opium only to the company at fixed prices. The company processed the raw material in its factories, packed it into wooden crates, and shipped it to China. Formally, the company did not sell opium directly, as that would have been an obvious violation of Chinese law. Instead, the opium was sold at auctions in Calcutta to private merchants, primarily British and Parsi traders. These merchants transported the opium on their fast clippers to the shores of China and sold it to smugglers. Transactions took place at anchorages off the coast of Guangdong province in the Pearl River estuary. There, special ships anchored floating warehouses that the English called receiving ships. Chinese smugglers arrived in small boats, paid in silver, and transported the opium crates deep into the country via rivers and canals. The system worked flawlessly. The British authorities received huge revenues from the sale of opium in India, money that constituted a significant part of the colonial administration's budget. Private merchants grew wealthy on the resale, and the silver obtained from the Chinese for the opium was used to purchase tea and silk. The trade balance began to shift. It was no longer the British bringing silver to China. Instead, the Chinese were losing their silver, purchasing a poison that was destroying their country. The demand for opium in China grew rapidly. By the 1800s, opium smoking had spread across the country. Special opium dens opened where people lay on bunks, smoked opium through long bamboo pipes, and drifted into blissful oblivion. Everyone became addicted: officials, soldiers, farmers, and artisans. The wealthy spent entire fortunes on opium. The poor sold their last possessions to obtain a dose. Families were destroyed. People stopped working and lost interest in life, thinking only of their next pipe of opium. By the 1830s, China faced a real catastrophe. Opium had penetrated all levels of society. Modern researchers offer varying estimates, but almost all agree that the number of people regularly smoking opium numbered not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions. These were not just numbers in officials' reports. Behind them were real lives. In villages, farmers abandoned their fields because all their energy went into obtaining money for opium. In cities, artisans stopped working. Soldiers of the imperial army lay in dens instead of performing their duties. Even among officials who were supposed to fight smuggling, many smoked opium themselves or took bribes from traders. Silver flowed out of the country like a river. Previously, China had been the world's wealthiest power, where precious metals flowed from all continents. Now, the situation had reversed. Every year, huge volumes of silver left the country. Different sources provide different estimates, but it reached hundreds of thousands, and by some calculations, millions of taels per year. The state treasury was empty. The emperor could not collect taxes in full because the population had no silver left. Food prices rose because silver coins became rare. Ordinary people suffered from inflation. Merchants refused to accept copper coins, demanding silver that no one possessed. The imperial court in Beijing realized the threat. Officials wrote reports warning of the approaching catastrophe. Some proposed legalizing opium, taxing it, and at least collecting revenue for the treasury. Others insisted on harsh measures: the death penalty for traitors, and the confiscation of property. The Daoguang emperor hesitated. He saw the empire crumbling from within but did not know which path to choose. In 1838, the emperor made a decision. He appointed a special commissioner to fight opium, Lin Zexu, the governor of Hunan and Hubei provinces, known for his incorruptibility and resolve. Lin was a Confucian scholar of the old school, a man of principle. He believed that a civil servant's duty was to serve the people and the emperor, not his own enrichment. In his province, he had already conducted a campaign against opium, closing dens and arresting traders. Now, the emperor tasked him with cleaning Guangzhou, the main gate of smuggling of opium. Lin arrived in Guangzhou in March 1839. He immediately launched vigorous activity. Local officials, many of whom were linked to smugglers, received an ultimatum. Either they help eradicate the opium trade, or they would be punished themselves. Lin ordered the arrest of Chinese opium traders, the confiscation of their goods, and the public execution of the most egregious offenders. But his main target was not the Chinese intermediaries. It was the source of the evil: the foreign merchants who brought the opium into the country. Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. In this letter, he appealed to her conscience, asking if she would allow the trade of opium within Britain itself, if it caused such suffering to her people. He pointed out that in England, opium was also considered a harmful substance, and its sale was restricted. Why then were the British poisoning the Chinese with something they did not want for themselves? The letter was composed in the traditional Chinese style, full of respect yet firm. Lin hoped that the Queen, upon learning the scale of the disaster, would order an end to the trade. The letter was sent, but it never reached its addressee. The British authorities simply ignored it. Then, Lin decided to act directly. He ordered the foreign quarter in Guangzhou to be surrounded by troops. Chinese servants and food suppliers were ordered to leave the factories. The foreigners found themselves effectively under siege. Lin demanded that they surrender all the opium located on their ships and in their warehouses. He promised that no one would be punished if they complied voluntarily, but if they refused, the harshest measures would follow. The chief representative of British merchants in China, Superintendent of Trade Charles Elliot, found himself in a difficult position. Formally, he represented the British government and was supposed to protect the interests of the Queen's subjects. Private merchants demanded that he oppose the Chinese authorities and protect their right to trade, but Lin Zexu did not back down. He made it clear, until the opium was surrendered, no one would leave the factory. Elliot realized he had no choice. He persuaded the merchants to surrender the opium, promising that the British government would compensate their losses. Over several weeks, the Chinese confiscated more than 1,000 tons of opium, 20,000 crates. It was a massive haul worth millions of pounds sterling. Lin Zexu did not simply burn the opium. Fire could spread the narcotic fumes, poisoning people. Instead, he ordered huge trenches to be dug on the seashore, filled with salt and lime, and flooded with water from the canals. The opium was tossed into this mixture and stirred with long poles until the entire drug dissolved. Then, the ditches were opened toward the sea, and the tide carried the poisoned water into the ocean. The destruction took several weeks. Lin personally watched the process to ensure not a single crate was stolen. The destruction of the opium became a public humiliation for Britain. Traders cried out about the violation of property rights. They demanded protection and compensation from the government. In London, heated debates began. Some believed that the opium trade was immoral and that China had every right to protect its citizens. Others insisted that Lin Zexu's actions were illegal. He had confiscated the property of British subjects without a trial and held them hostage. Free trade was a sacred principle of Victorian Britain. Restricting it was considered unacceptable. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston leaned toward a hardline stance. He saw the actions of China not merely as a conflict over opium, but as an assault on British dignity and trade interests. Palmerston was a staunch supporter of colonial expansion. He believed Britain should impose its will on backward countries, opening their markets to British goods by force if necessary. China, with its arrogance and isolation, irritated him particularly. The government decided to send a military expedition to China. Officially, it was announced that the goal was to protect British subjects and achieve justice for the illegal confiscation of property. They tried not to mention the opium trade aloud. In Parliament, opponents of the war called it shameful, saying that Britain was waging war for the right to poison the Chinese with drugs. Member of Parliament, William Gladstone, the future Prime Minister, delivered a fiery speech against the war. He called it unjust and immoral, saying it would cover Britain in eternal shame. But the majority of deputies voted for military action. The votes were split almost evenly, 270, 1 for and 260, 2 against. A difference of 9 votes decided the fate of China for the coming century. In the summer of 1840, a British squadron arrived off the coast of China. 16 warships, 4 armed steamers, and 27 transport ships with 4,000 soldiers and sailors. For China, this was an unseen force. The Manchu army numbered hundreds of thousands, but it was armed with outdated weapons, muskets, bows, spears, and swords. The Chinese fleet consisted of wooden junks, completely incapable of opposing modern steam warships, with heavy artillery. The British did not attack Guangzhou immediately. Instead, they moved north along the coast, blocking ports one after another. In July, they captured the island of Zhoushan off the coast of Zhejiang province. The Chinese garrison did not resist for long. After a short bombardment, most of the soldiers fled. The British occupied the city of Dinghai with almost no casualties. Then, the squadron moved further north to the mouth of the Haihe River, leading to Tianjin and Beijing. It was a direct strike at the heart of the empire. The Daoguang Emperor was terrified. He did not expect the barbarians would dare to attack so far from the southern border. The appearance of warships at the gates of the capital caused panic at court. The emperor accused Lin Zexu of provoking the conflict with his harsh actions. Lin was recalled from Guangzhou and sent into exile in distant Xinjiang. A new negotiator was appointed, Qishan, a Manchu official who held a more flexible approach. Qishan began negotiations with the British. He agreed to pay compensation for the destroyed opium and open additional ports for trade. But the British demanded more. They wanted an island as a permanent base where they could live without Chinese control. They insisted on the right to try their subjects by British laws, not Chinese. This would mean the end of Chinese sovereignty in that territory. In January 1841, the British occupied the forts defending the approaches to Guangzhou. Qishan signed a preliminary agreement under which China was to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, pay 6 million taels of silver, and resume trade. But when the text of the agreement reached Beijing, the emperor flew into a rage. He considered the conditions humiliating. Qishan was removed from office and sentenced to death, later commuted to exile. The emperor ordered preparations for decisive resistance. The British commander was also dissatisfied with the agreement. London considered the conditions too soft. Palmerston recalled the negotiators and ordered the resumption of military operations. The war resumed with new force. In the spring of 1841, British troops captured key forts in the Pearl River Delta, opening the way upstream. Chinese troops suffered huge losses. British cannons bombarded Chinese positions from a distance inaccessible to return fire. Steam warships approached the shore and methodically destroyed fortifications. Chinese soldiers fought bravely, but their 16th-century muskets were useless against modern weaponry. Artillery stood on outdated wooden carriages. Cannons often exploded upon firing, killing their own crews. Commanders did not know modern tactics. They lined up troops in dense rows as their ancestors had done 100 years ago, and British grapeshot killed them by the hundreds. After every battle, the Chinese collected the bodies of the dead. The numbers grew exponentially, while the British lost only a handful of soldiers. In the summer of 1841, the British squadron entered the Yangtze River, China's main water artery. The Yangtze connected the richest provinces of central China with the sea, carrying rice, silk, tea, and cotton. Blocking the Yangtze meant paralyzing the empire's economy. The British ships moved upstream, capturing city after city. Chinese troops tried to stop them, but unsuccessfully. In August, the British approached Nanjing, one of the most important cities in the empire, the ancient capital of several dynasties. Nanjing stood on the southern bank of the Yangtze, surrounded by powerful walls. In the city were imperial warehouses, arsenals, and treasuries. The loss of Nanjing would be a terrible blow to the prestige of the Qing dynasty. The British prepared to storm. Ships anchored, directing their guns at the city walls. Soldiers sharpened their bayonets, preparing for street fighting. The imperial court realized that further resistance was pointless. China had no strength to stop the British. The army was demoralized. The treasury was empty. Officials were corrupt, and the people were dissatisfied. If the war continued, the barbarians might reach Beijing itself. The emperor agreed to negotiations. He appointed Chiang, a high-ranking Manchu official, and Yilibu, a Chinese official known for his intellect and diplomatic skills, as lead negotiators. The negotiations took place on board the British warship HMS Cornwallis, which stood at anchor in Nanjing. The British presented their demands. The conditions were harsh. China had to pay 21 million taels of silver, a huge sum that included compensation for the destroyed opium, reimbursement for Britain's war expenses, and ransom for the captured cities. 5 ports were to be opened to British trade: Guangzhou, Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. British subjects received the right of extraterritoriality. They could only be judged by British laws and British courts. The Chinese authorities had no power over them. Tariffs on imported goods were to be established by agreement with Britain, not by the will of China. The Chinese negotiators tried to bargain, but they had no trumps. British cannons stood ready, and soldiers waited for the order to storm. On 29 Augustus 1842, the Chinese side signed the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of the unequal treaties that would define China's relations with Western powers for a century. News of the signing reached Beijing in early autumn. The emperor received it with bitterness but without surprise. He understood there was no other way. However, the terms of the treaty meant the end of the old world order. China could no longer consider itself the center of the universe, to whom barbarians brought tribute. Now, it was the defeated side, forced to submit to the demands of the victors. The opening of 5 ports for trade meant that the British gained access to the very heart of the Chinese economy. Shanghai quickly turned into the main trade center. Not only British, but American, French, and German merchants flocked there. On the banks of the Huangpu River, quarters of foreign concessions grew territories where European laws applied, European banks operated, and European houses and churches were built. The Chinese watched this with bewilderment and pain. In their own country, they were becoming second-class citizens. Hong Kong, a small and rocky island with small fishing villages, began to turn into a British colony. The British built a port, shipyards, warehouses, and barracks. They laid roads, erected administrative buildings, and created parks. Trading houses that had previously sat in the cramped factories of Guangzhou moved there. Hong Kong became a base for Britain's further expansion into China, a showcase of Western civilization on the eastern edge of the empire. But most importantly, the treaty said nothing about the opium trade. The British did not insist on its legalization in the text of the agreement. Formally, opium remained prohibited in China, but in practice, the trade continued and even expanded. Now that 5 ports were open, it was easier for smugglers to import opium. Chinese officials, frightened by the defeat in the war, were afraid to strictly pursue foreign traders. They took bribes and turned a blind eye to violations. The flow of opium into China not only did not decrease but grew manifold. By the end of the 1840s, more than 4,000 tons of opium were brought into China annually. The number of dependent people, according to contemporaries and researchers, was already several million. Opium was smoked in every city and every village. New dens opened, often disguised as tea houses or restaurants. In the back rooms, there were bunks covered with mats, and oil lamps burned. There, people lay, inhaling smoke from long pipes, plunging into blissful numbness. The fumes of opium hung in the air in a thick, sweetish mist. The Treaty of Nanjing did not bring peace to China. On the contrary, it opened the road for new demands and new conflicts. Other Western powers did not want to be left behind. The United States signed the Treaty of Wangjie with China in 1844, receiving the same privileges as Britain. France concluded the Treaty of Whampoa in 1844, adding protection for Catholic missionaries to their trade rights. Western powers operated on the principle of most favored nation status. Any privilege given to one country automatically extended to all others. The British were dissatisfied. They wanted more. The opening of 5 ports seemed insufficient. Traders demanded access to the interior of the country, the right to sail rivers, and to trade in inland cities. They wanted opium to be officially legalized so that they would not have to engage in smuggling and bribe Chinese officials. The British government received their petitions and complaints. Diplomats in Beijing insisted on a revision of the treaty. The Chinese government resisted. The emperor and his advisors understood that every new concession led to further humiliation. They stalled for time, refused to meet with foreign envoys, and invented bureaucratic obstacles. Traditional Chinese diplomacy was built on evasiveness, on the ability to decide nothing for months and years, exhausting the opponent with waiting. But the British did not wish to wait. In October 1856, an incident occurred that gave cause for a new war. Chinese authorities in Guangzhou arrested the crew of the Chinese vessel Arrow, which was registered in Hong Kong and formerly sailed under the British flag. The Chinese accused the sailors of piracy and smuggling. The British consul in Guangzhou demanded the immediate release of the detainees, citing that the ship was British and the Chinese authorities had no right to touch its crew. The Chinese responded that all the sailors were Chinese. The ship belonged to a Chinese owner, and the British registration was fraudulent and had long since expired. The British consul did not accept the explanations. He declared that the arrest of the sailors was an insult to the British flag and required satisfaction. When the Chinese authorities refused to apologize, the British naval fleet in the South China Sea received orders to act. Ships bombarded the forts of Guangzhou and destroyed several government buildings in the city. The Chinese responded by setting fire to foreign factories. The conflict grew rapidly. In London, Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, who had unleashed the first Opium War 13 years earlier, again called for decisive action. He convinced Parliament that China was not fulfilling the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, was constantly violating the rights of British subjects, and was showing disrespect to the British Empire. A new military expedition was needed to finally put the Chinese in their place. France joined Britain. The French also had claims against China. In 1856, a French missionary was killed in Guangxi province, and Paris demanded the punishment of the perpetrators and compensation. By the end of 1857, a combined Anglo-French squadron arrived off the coast of China. This time there were more forces than in the First War. The British and French acted in coordination. In December, the Allies captured Guangzhou, taking prisoner the provincial governor, Ye Mingshan, whom they sent into exile in Calcutta. The city came under foreign control. In the spring of 1858, the squadron moved north. Ships approached the mouth of the Baihe River, leading to Tianjin and Beijing. The emperor was forced to begin negotiations. Chinese plenipotentiaries signed the Treaty of Tianjin in June 1858. The conditions were even heavier than in Nanjing. 10 new ports were opened. Foreigners were allowed to travel in the interior of China. Christian missionaries received the right to preach throughout the country. China had to pay huge indemnities, 4 million taels to Britain and 2 million to France. And most importantly, the opium trade was effectively legalized. In the tariff agreements, opium was included in the list of ordinary imported goods that could be brought into China, subject to customs duties. In practice, this meant official recognition of opium as a legal subject of trade. The Xianfeng emperor, who had succeeded the late Daoguang on the throne, read the terms of the Treaty of Tianjin with horror. Legalization of opium meant official recognition that the empire could not protect its subjects from poison. Opening the interior regions to foreigners and missionaries threatened to undermine the traditional Chinese way of life. The emperor decided not to ratify the treaty. He hoped that if he dragged out the matter, perhaps he could find a way to avoid fulfilling the most humiliating conditions. In June 1859, British and French diplomats were to arrive in Beijing to exchange ratification documents. They set off up the Baihe River on their ships, but the Chinese had secretly installed barriers on the river chains and wooden piles that blocked the fairway. When the ships approached the barriers, Chinese shore batteries opened fire. Several ships were damaged, and there were dead and wounded. The British had to retreat. This was a serious mistake. The emperor hoped that a show of force would make the Europeans make concessions. Instead, he gave them a pretext for a new, even more brutal military campaign. In London and Paris, the shelling was perceived as a treacherous attack and a violation of all norms of international law. A new expedition was prepared, significantly larger than the previous one. In the summer of 1860, a huge armada approached the coast of North China, more than 200 ships and 18,000 soldiers, 11,000 British and 7,000 French. It was the largest European military operation in Asia at that time. The expedition was commanded by British General James Hope Grant and French General Charles Cousin Montauban. The troops landed in Baitang Bay in August. Chinese troops defending the forts at the mouth of the Baihe River resisted desperately, but their outdated weaponry could not stop a modern army. After several days of fighting, the forts fell. The Allies moved deep into the country in the direction of Beijing. The emperor gathered 30,000 Manchu and Mongol horsemen, elite troops who were considered the best in the empire, and sent them to stop the barbarians. On September 21, near the Baliqiao Bridge in the suburbs of Beijing, the decisive battle took place. The Chinese cavalry attacked the Allies with a ferocity worthy of the best military traditions. The horsemen rushed at the enemy, brandishing sabers and shooting bows, but the British and French infantry met them with volleys of rifles and grape shot. The cavalry charge shattered against a wall of fire. The battlefield was covered with the bodies of men and horses. The Chinese army was routed. The road to Beijing was open. The emperor attempted to negotiate. He sent an embassy to the Allies led by a high-ranking official and proposed to resume discussions on peace terms. The British and French agreed to negotiate and sent their representatives. But when the European diplomats arrived at the Chinese positions with an escort, they were suddenly arrested. About 40 people, diplomats, officers, soldiers of the escort, and journalists were seized and sent to prison in Beijing. They were tortured, and many died in confinement. When the Allies learned of this, their rage was terrible. Violation of the immunity of parliamentarians was considered a grave war crime. British commander, Lord Elgin, vowed revenge. On October 6, Allied troops entered Beijing. The emperor was not in the capital. He had fled to Jehol, the summer residence in the north. Looting began in the city. Soldiers robbed shops, houses, and temples. Officers did not try to stop them. After the news of the torture and murder of prisoners, no one wanted to restrain the troops. But the main blow was struck at the old summer palace, Yuanmingyuan. This was a huge park complex on the outskirts of Beijing, created by the Qing dynasty emperors over a century and a half. Hundreds of pavilions, temples, libraries, and theaters were spread among gardens, ponds, and artificial hills. Priceless works of art were stored there. Paintings, calligraphy, bronze vessels, jade statues, porcelain, and silk scrolls. The palace was a symbol of the grandeur and cultural flourishing of Chinese civilization. On October 18, the British set fire to the old summer palace. Lord Elgin personally gave the order for the arson, considering it a just retribution for the murder of the prisoners. 3,500 British soldiers received orders to set fire to all the buildings of the complex. The fire blazed for 3 days. Wooden pavilions burned to the ground. Stone cracked from the heat. Bronze roofs melted. Priceless books, paintings, and manuscripts turned to ash. What did not burn was looted beforehand. Soldiers stuffed their pockets with gold jewelry, silk fabrics, and gems. Officers took away entire crates of treasures. The destruction of the old summer palace became a symbol of China's humiliation. For the Chinese, this was a tragedy comparable to the fall of a dynasty. Emperors had created Yuan over 150 years, pouring into it not only wealth but their souls. It embodied the best achievements of Chinese art, architecture, and garden design. European missionaries who had seen the palace before its destruction compared it to Versailles and called it the eighth wonder of the world, and all of it was destroyed in 3 days. Victor Hugo, the great French writer, wrote a letter of protest, condemning the actions of his country. He said that Europeans called themselves civilized but behaved like barbarians, destroying monuments of culture, looting, and killing. History will judge them, Hugo wrote, and future generations will be ashamed of what their ancestors did in China. His voice was one of the few loud manifestations of protest. Critics of the Opium Wars existed in Europe but remained in the minority against those who considered the brutal punishment of China justified. On the 24th of October 1860, in the Hall of Rituals in the Forbidden City, the Convention of Beijing was signed. China recognized all the terms of the Treaty of Tianjin, adding new humiliations to them. The indemnity was increased to 8 million taels for Britain and an equal amount for France. Tianjin was opened as a port for trade. The Kowloon Peninsula opposite Hong Kong was ceded to Britain, expanding the territory of the colony. The opium trade was finally legalized. The narcotic became an ordinary commodity. Russia, which formally did not participate in the war but exerted diplomatic pressure on China, also received its share. By the Convention of Beijing, Russia annexed the Ussuri region, a huge territory to the east of the Ussuri River to the sea. The city of Vladivostok was founded there. China lost control over lands it had considered its own for centuries. After the war, the opium trade grew completely. British traders no longer hid or paid bribes to smugglers. They officially registered their cargo at customs, paid duties to the Chinese treasury, and transported opium deep into the country via rivers and roads. The Chinese government received revenue from the drug trade, but the price of this income was too high. Opium dependency gripped all layers of society. By the end of the 19th century, by various estimates, several million, and according to some estimates, tens of millions of people were regularly smoking opium. Mass addiction became one of the country's main afflictions. The social consequences were catastrophic. In villages, farmers abandoned their fields because the money earned by hard labor went to opium. Families starved. Children did not receive education. In cities, artisans lost their skills. Workers could not perform their jobs. The country's economy degraded. China, which at the beginning of the 19th century was the wealthiest country in the world, by the end of the century turned into a semi-colony divided into spheres of influence by Western powers. Opium destroyed not only bodies but society. Respect for the law vanished because the law did not work. Corruption penetrated all levels of power. Officials who were supposed to fight the trade in narcotics owned dens themselves or received a cut from smugglers. Police took bribes. Judges issued sentences depending on the size of the gift. The army decomposed. Soldiers smoked opium instead of training. When uprisings like the Taiping or the Boxer Rebellion began at the end of the century, the government could not cope with them because the army was incapacitated. Intellectuals saw the link between the opium trade and the country's decline. Reformers called on the emperor to ban opium once and for all, close the dens, and punish traders with death. But the government was powerless. Contracts with Western powers protected the opium trade. An attempt to break these contracts could lead to a new war and new humiliations. The Qing dynasty tried to find a way out. At the end of the 19th century, attempts at modernization began. Factories and railways were built, and a modern fleet was created. But all reforms were conducted too slowly and too inconsistently. The conservative elite resisted change, fearing the loss of power and privileges. Young reformers lacked sufficient support. The country was stuck between the old and the new, unable to return to the past or move into the future. By the beginning of the 20th century, the opium problem had become an international scandal. Even in Britain itself, voices were raised demanding an end to the trade that disgraced the nation. Missionaries working in China wrote about the suffering of the people, about children born to mothers who had smoked opium for years who were often weak and sickly from their first months of life, and about entire villages mired in a narcotic swamp. Photographs of emaciated smokers lying in dirty dens were published in European newspapers, causing public outrage. At the turn of the 20th century, Chinese society began to realize the scale of the disaster. Opium was no longer perceived as just an individual weakness. It was a national tragedy, a threat to the very existence of Chinese civilization. Reformers and revolutionaries, regardless of their political views, agreed on one thing: opium must be banned, otherwise China would perish as an independent state. In 1906, the Qing government, realizing that the empire stood on the brink of an abyss, began the first serious anti-opium campaign. Decrees were issued to close dens, ban the cultivation of the opium poppy within the country, and limit imports. Officials were ordered to strictly prosecute offenders, and special clinics for the treatment of addicts were created. Propagandists went through cities and villages, explaining the harm of opium, convincing people to quit smoking. The campaign yielded noticeable results. Within 10 years, areas under poppy cultivation shrank. The number of officially registered smokers fell sharply. In a number of provinces, opium almost disappeared, although this did not solve the problem completely. Part of the trade went underground. Smuggling continued. Opium was brought across the border with Burma, where British colonial authorities continued to allow its production. Corrupt officials found ways to bypass the bans. In 1911, a revolution occurred in China. The Qing dynasty fell, and a new government arose in its place. But the country plunged into the chaos of civil wars. Local military commanders, so-called warlords, controlled individual provinces. Many of them earned money from the opium trade, using the income to maintain their armies. The central government was weak and could not restore order. International pressure on Britain grew. In 1909, an International Opium Commission was held in Shanghai, where representatives of 13 countries discussed the drug problem. The Chinese delegation presented evidence of the monstrous harm that opium had inflicted on the country. The Americans supported the Chinese, calling for international control over the opium trade. The British government, unwilling to endure more criticism, began to gradually wind down opium production in India. In 1913, Britain and China signed an agreement on a complete ban on the import of Indian opium into China by 1917. This was an important step, but it came too late. Over 70 years of the opium trade, China had lost millions of lives. The economy was destroyed. Society was demoralized. The country turned into a semi-colony divided between European powers, Japan, and the United States. World War I distracted European attention from China. Britain and France fought in the trenches of Europe. They had no time to control the Chinese market. But the opium problem did not go away. Moreover, new players appeared. Japan, having seized the northeastern provinces of China in the 1930s, created the puppet state of Manchukuo there, and began to encourage the opium trade itself, using the drug as a tool for subjugating the Chinese population. Only after 1949, when the communists under the leadership of Mao Zedong won the Civil War and proclaimed the People's Republic of China, could the authorities finally eradicate opium. The new government acted with harsh methods. Dens were closed by force, traders were shot, and the addicted were sent to forced treatment camps. Fields of opium poppies were destroyed. Within a few years, the authorities achieved what their ancestors had failed to do for a century. The legal opium trade and open dens were liquidated. Mass consumption of opium practically disappeared. The memory of the Opium Wars remained a deep wound in the Chinese national consciousness. For the Chinese, these wars became a symbol of the century of humiliation, a period from 1840 to 1949 when the once great empire was humiliated, looted, and divided between foreign powers. In modern China, the ruined old summer palace remains a monument to the barbarism of Western powers. Its ruins are preserved intentionally. The authorities do not restore the pavilions, leaving the scorched stones and overgrown foundations as a reminder of what happened. The Opium Wars changed not only China but the world order. They showed that Western powers were prepared to use any methods, including the distribution of narcotics and direct military aggression, to protect their economic interests. The free trade that Britain proclaimed turned out to be the freedom to impose its will on weak countries by force of arms. Victorian England, which loved to speak of civilization and progress, simultaneously poisoned an entire nation with poison for the sake of profit. The economic consequences of the wars were catastrophic for China. The payment of indemnities emptied the state treasury. Opening ports for foreign trade destroyed the traditional economy. Local artisans could not compete with cheap factory-made goods from Europe. Silver continued to flow out of the country, causing constant shortages of money and inflation. Farmers, forced to pay taxes in silver they did not have, were ruined and started uprisings. The social structure of Chinese society collapsed. The Confucian system of values that had held society together for centuries no longer worked. Officials who were supposed to be models of virtue smoked opium and took bribes. Scholars stopped preparing for imperial exams because education no longer guaranteed a career. The military could not protect the country. Respect for authority vanished because the authorities had shown their helplessness in the face of foreign aggression. Narcotic addiction destroyed families from generation to generation. Children born in families where mothers had smoked opium for years were often born weak, fell ill heavily, and died early. Entire villages turned into clusters of dilapidated houses where emaciated people lived, unable to work. Fields grew over with weeds, craft workshops closed, and trade stalled. The country that had once fed a third of humanity now could not feed its own population. The cultural trauma of the Opium Wars defined the development of China in the 20th century. Revolutionaries who overthrew the Qing dynasty in 1911 constantly appealed to the memory of national humiliation, calling for the revival of the country. The communists used the same motifs. They promised to return China to its former glory, rid the country of foreign dominance, and eradicate the legacy of the colonial past. Even today, in the 21st century, Chinese leaders speak of the Chinese dream as the revival of the nation after the century of humiliation. The Opium Wars became a warning to the world of what uncontrolled drug trade leads to. China learned this lesson harshly. The modern People's Republic of China applies some of the most severe punishments for drug crimes in the world, including the death penalty even for mid-level traders. The memory of how opium almost destroyed the nation still defines the country's anti-narcotic policy. The history of the Opium Wars shows how economic interests can eclipse moral principles. British merchants knew that opium was destroying the lives of millions of people, but they cared only about profit. The British government understood the immorality of the drug trade, but defended it with the force of arms because it brought huge revenues. Parliamentarians in London voted for war, knowing it was being unleashed for the right to poison the Chinese. And only a few voices, such as Gladstone or Victor Hugo, condemned what was happening, but they were not heard. For China, the Opium Wars became the beginning of a long and painful path of revival from a great empire to a semi-colony, from a semi-colony to a country torn by civil wars, from the chaos of the communist revolution, and from isolation to economic reforms. This path, a century and a half long, was an attempt to overcome the consequences of those wars. Modern China, which has become the second largest economy in the world, perceives its revival as a revanche for the humiliation of the 19th century. The ruins of the old summer palace remind us of what was and of what must never happen again.